I'm just going to show you one thing just real quick from my devotions this morning. It's not necessarily Joshua, so go to the book of Exodus just real quick. Exodus 33. This is something neat that I was reading this morning. So Exodus 33, we'll start in verse 13. So this is Moses, right? The people have just done the golden calf, right? And so the Lord is upset with the Israelites. And Moses says to them, this is after Moses had ground up the golden calf, had everybody drink that, right? So they ground up the golden calf and drink it. And then he tells the Levites, not just specifically the Levites, but he says anybody that's for the Lord, I want you to go from one end of the camp to the other and kill anyone that you come in contact with, even if it's your own brother. With the implication that it was people that were stirring up the trouble, so you go through the camp and wipe them out. And so they kind of go through and 3,000 of them were killed. And so, in the image there is a comparison to the book of Acts, that when the law was given, 3,000 were killed when Moses came down on the mountain with the law. But the day that the Holy Spirit was poured out, 3,000 were saved, right? And so that's the comparison between the law and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. But so they're back up on the mountain, and Moses, after he does all that, says, okay, now that you've done something on your end, let me go up there and see if I can talk with the Lord, because last Moses heard God just told him to go down there and deal with the people. He's not aware of what God's response is going to be. Is God, utterly upset with them? Is God going to forgive them? He doesn't know. So he says, I'm going to go back up on the mountain and see if I can plead with the Lord for you. And so they get up there, and this is this kind of famous conversation that Moses has where he's saying, Lord, if you're not going to go with us, then I don't want to go, right? And so that's kind of what this is. So verse 13, he says, now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, so that I might know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider, too, that this nation is your people. And then in verse 14, God says, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And he said to him, now this is Moses speaking again, if your presence will not go with me, don't bring us up from here. Now, doesn't that seem kind of strange that he's still saying, well, Lord, why won't you go with us? Because God just said, I'm going to go with you. And then Moses' next thing is, well, God, if you're not going to go with me, then I don't want to go. And it seems kind of strange in English. But the key to understanding it is that in the Hebrew there, when God says, I will go with you, it is you singular. They have a distinction in the language between singular and plural. It is you singular, not you plural. And so when the Lord is saying, when Moses says, we want your presence, God says, okay, I will go with you, and I will give you rest, singular. You kind of lose that in the English. And so when Moses comes back in and still pleads with him, it's because he understood the Lord to be saying that God would be with him only, and then the rest of the people that had just sinned, he would not be with. And then...
but he said, I'm going to be with you guys.
Yeah. And so, that's the Northeast translation. I'll be with you guys. And so it's interesting. He says, then he goes on in 15, he says, and he said to him, if your presence will not go with me.
With us is my version.
Yeah, so yours says with us? Okay. Yeah, that's probably what it should be. This one, shake it and change it here. But then in this one, this is the English Standard. It goes on to say it in the second verse, do not bring us up from here, right? And so if your version says us in that next verse, that's probably an even better way of seeing it, that he's transitioning from talking about I will go with you to no, but Lord, I need you to go with us, right? Because the whole thing that God had been showing him was the tabernacle, which was going to be his presence with them. And so then God says, I'm not going with you now, which really didn't invalidate everything that God had just been showing him about the tabernacle, because the tabernacle was where God was going to be with them. And so all of the previous stuff in Exodus was God showing him how to build the tabernacle. And then Moses comes back after their sin, and God says, I'm not going with you. which means then everything that he had just told him about the tabernacle was not gonna be there. And he says, but I will go with you because you found favor in my sight. And he says, no, Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, go with us, right? And then he says, is it not you're going with us so that we are distinct, right? He's saying that you being with us is what makes us a distinct people. If we don't have you, then we have nothing. He says, I and your people from every other people on the face of the earth were distinct because of you. Verse 17, the Lord said to Moses, this very thing you have spoken I will do for you, because you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. And so it's kind of interesting, he says, because you found favor. Some translations say because you're pleasing in my sight. Does anybody says that, or does everybody say favor?
Found grace.
Found grace. Yeah, so really what that is saying, he says that you are pleasing in my sight, is what kind of the better way to understand that phrase. And so anyways, the interesting comparison between that and the New Testament is that when Jesus is baptized, because now Moses is the mediator, right, between God and the people, and God is saying, okay, I will be with the people even though they've sinned. I was going to be just with you, but because you are pleasing in my sight, I will not only be with you, I'll also be with the people because of you, right? He's not saying I like these people, and so I'm going to be with these people. He's saying, Moses, because you have found favor in my sight. Now, Moses obviously is the type of Christ, the mediator between God and man. He's saying, because you have found favor in my sight, then I will have grace on these people, and I will be with them as well. And so when Jesus comes up out of the waters of baptism, the phrase that God uses is he says, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased, right? So in other words, what he's saying is he's drawing a comparison between what he said to Moses. He's saying, I will have grace on the people because the mediator is pleasing in my sight in the Old Testament. And in the same way, when Christ comes up out of baptism, God is pointing the spotlight on him and saying, this is your mediator. Listen to what he says because he's pleasing in my sight. And so there is going to be grace for you because of who he is, right? So that's just kind of some interesting stuff.